Hello. Today I'm going to be answering 11 shortish questions in one video. The first, how did people deal with bugs, especially ticks and mosquitoes? Was summer just a war zone of bloodsucking, or were there things that could be done to minimize your contact with pests pre-contact? There were several options for dealing with mosquitoes. The first was site placement and environmental management. You don't build a village anywhere near a swamp or standing water. You build it up on a hill to aid in defensibility, but also because mosquitoes don't like elevation. The forests near the village you extensively manage, clearing out a lot of the underbrush. Less underbrush means more airflow, which means less humidity, which means less mosquitoes. There were two other solutions. One of these was pre-Columbian bug spray. There were a variety of recipes for this, but most of them seem to have involved animal fat and some sort of conifer extract. Bear grease and balsam gum seems to have been a common combination. Another was made with the extract of boiled needles mixed in with fat and then rubbed into the hair like conditioner. The third option was smoke. On particularly buggy days, people would burn dried corn cobs at the edge of the village. If people had to venture into a particularly buggy area, they might walk around with a pipe hanging out of their mouth. I haven't found any information about how people used to deal with ticks. The next question. How did the Longhouse evolve post-contact to the present day? So prior to contact, the standard Longhouse was about the size of this one I showed in that other video. They usually housed about 2 or 3 dozen people. Post-contact, the first change we see is that they got a lot bigger. The 1600s were an extremely dangerous time, so populations contracted. People started living more densely for protection. Villages became larger and fewer, and so did the longhouses. It was not uncommon for longhouses in the mid to late 1600s to house 100 or 200 or more people. Throughout the 1700s, the longhouse became smaller. Initially, this was just a readjustment to what was before. The early 1700s were much less violent than the 1600s. People didn't need the same level of protection in this era, and I can imagine that 200 people living in the same house is a bit much, so people went back to the 2 dozen size. As the 1700s went on, the houses got smaller and smaller. This was largely due to increasing Christianization. The Anglican missionaries coming in and preaching that it's sinful for unmarried men and women to be living in the same house. By the mid-1700s, most longhouses would house only a single nuclear family. Throughout this era, the longhouse also increasingly fell out of use in favor of European-style log cabins. After relocating following the American Revolution, people almost exclusively built log cabins. These remained the standard form of housing until the 1940s. The next question. Where did people go to the toilet? To my knowledge, it isn't known. Latrines are fairly obvious archaeologically, and they have not been found, so we can say people were not using latrines. However, we also know people weren't just leaving it out in the open, lying around every which where. Archaeological soil analyses from within village sites have failed to find traces of human waste. So what all of this tells us is that there was a solution, but it was located outside of the villages. Maybe there was a latrine, but it was located half a mile away so nobody had to smell it, or maybe people just went for a walk in the woods with a shovel. Occasionally these soil analyses will find a spot out and around the corner of a longhouse where there are significant traces of urea. The theory behind these is that they were from people who, in the middle of winter, had to go in the middle of the night. People don't want to be putting on all of their winter clothes to trudge out to the proper spot in the middle of the freezing cold winter night, so they just going around the corner and hope nobody notices. So somebody else gets the same idea and goes out, sees a patch of melted snow and says, well, if I go in the same spot, nobody will be any the wiser. Perfect crime. The lack of solid waste in these locations suggests their impromptu nature. Next question. How did people get salt? Was salt traded for from the coast? The short answer is people didn't get salt. The early explorers visiting indigenous villages are often dismayed and disgusted at the lack of salt at the table. Apparently, indigenous people in the region thought salt was bad for you, so they didn't add it to food. This is unusual as salt was harvested and added to food not too far south, and there are salt springs in Seneca and Onondaga territory. So how did people function then without salt? To put it simply, they didn't have to. Salt has got 2 main functions in your body. One of them is to balance out your water, and the other one is to act as a neurotransmitter. On the former, your body can adjust to varying levels of salt. Your body adapts to what's available. You lose less through sweat, you retain less water. On the neurotransmitter side, the sodium that you need can be found in meat. Other salts besides sodium can fill this role, such as potassium, which is found abundantly in many indigenous crops, particularly live corn. In short, if you've got a healthy diet, you don't need supplementary sources. Next question. How common do you think wooden armor was in the past? Was it reserved specifically for high-status individuals, or did everybody have some? The materials required are not hard to come by. It mostly just takes time. I think everybody over 30 would have as much as they desired. I think it would be fairly feasible for most people to have a breastplate at the least. There are also corners that can be cut in the construction. For example, using leather strips rather than twine. Leather is faster to produce than twine, and it's faster to weave as leather is much thicker. Bigger gaps though, so maybe a more important distinction was quality rather than availability. Next question. What awareness did the Iroquois have of the wider world? What sense did they have of the rest of the continent and its people, and what was their process of comprehending the wider world introduced by contact with the Europeans? My impression is that there was likely a vague awareness of most of the groups on the continent, but not likely an understanding except for those that you interact with frequently. Sort of like modern-day impressions, but more vague. I imagine it was sort of like my understanding of China, right? I know China exists, but I can't really tell you anything about China besides stereotypes. They got some nice architecture and they eat rice. I'd imagine people in the Great Lakes region, they were aware of peoples like the Aztecs, but that awareness was limited to, okay, if we go far enough south, there's some weird people who live in great big cities made of stone and they might sell us some cotton for a high price. There are modern stories about how people back in the day had heard about the explorers before they showed up, long before the Europeans came to northern North America. Oh, watch out, there's some people with light skin and shiny clothing causing trouble down in Mexico. I don't know if those stories are true, but they exist. I want to talk about travel. Even with the difficulties of pre-modern travel, people sometimes went a long old way. There's one story I read in some history book or other about the early explorers going through BC in the mid-1800s. They're mapping things out and taking note of all the indigenous groups they meet. Then they notice that this one group has very different canoes from all of the other groups nearby. And one of the explorers who knows a thing or two, he says, "Hey, wait a minute. That's an Iroquoian-style canoe. What the heck is an Iroquoian-style canoe doing way the heck out here in middle of BC?" So they start asking around and get the story. And apparently, about 100 years ago, there was a group of traders that came in, and there was an argument, and the long story short, the traders, they got all killed. So the people start going through the traders' stuff, and they try out the canoe, and they say, "Hey, this is pretty good. This works well." So they start making their own after that style. So assuming that the traders identified it correctly as an Iroquoian-style canoe, and it wasn't an Ojibwe or a Cree-style canoe, that's like 4,000 kilometers as the crow flies. Probably a lot more on the ground. Even before modern means of transport, people sometimes traveled very far. Next question. You mentioned ritualized border disputes. Can you elaborate on this topic? My impression of pre-Columbian warfare is that there are two major kinds: petty feuds and ritualized border disputes, with what we might commonly understand as full-scale warfare being quite rare. Petty feuds are self-explanatory, eye for an eye type nonsense. The ritualized warfare I would describe as a deterrent. Not trying to kill people, not trying to take territory, not trying to achieve any militarily significant goals. What you're trying to do is show the enemy that you're tough and not to be messed with. You don't want to pursue an all-out war against us because we're hardcore and we'll mess you up. Anything you hope to achieve through an invasion is going to be worth less than what it costs you. From La Fitau. On occasions of this sort, their small number permits them to draw together, so to speak, body to body, and fight as in a duel, as the heroes of the Iliad and Aeneid did. Quite often they know each other and speak to each other. They ask each other news, harangue, insult, and pay each other compliments. Next question. How was traditional leather clothing cleaned? I've never tried this, but apparently if it's smoked it can just be washed like wools. Let it soak, lightly agitate, and then lay it flat in the sun to dry. For unsmoked leather, like in dress clothes where you absolutely can't get it wet, the way they were cleaned was by taking white clay, grinding it up into powder, and then rubbing it into the leather. This clay powder would bind with any grease that was on the leather, and you could then just dust it off with a brush or by hanging it up and then beating it with a stick. Next question. I just read something about how the Germanic Filgia, follower soul, can appear as an animal in the Norse sagas. Were spirit animals a thing among Six Nations people? Spirit animals are sort of a frustrating subject for me because they've been so co-opted by the New Age hipster flakes. The pervasiveness of the New Age understanding sort of pollutes any attempts at real understanding. The short answer is yes, but not in the way that's commonly thought of. It's not like a ghost dog that follows you around, it's more like an affirmation of inner character. You go through a set of month-long trials and you fast for 10 days, and if you have a lucid dream during that period, it's supposed to tell you something about yourself. There's more, but spirituality is not really my field. I'm not really qualified to talk about stuff like that. Next question. Imagine a perfect world where a great TV show or movie or video game or something is made. It's made with its protagonist or central characters or entire cast of Six Nations folks. Maybe it's pre-contact, maybe it's modern day, up to you. They do everything right. They bring on people who know what they're talking about to write it. Everything's perfect. What small details or big ideas would you like to see in something like that? Is it something you'd like to see at all? Well, the short answer is I want to see a lot more mundanity. I want all this stuff that's kind of unusual to the modern lens to be portrayed as completely ordinary and unremarkable. Here's the expositional dialogue scene in our period drama, and rather than having the two women sitting at a table talking back and forth, they're both sitting on the ground peeling bits of meat and sinew off of a fresh deerskin. And nobody comments on it, and the camera doesn't pay any attention to what they're doing, right? It's just incidental. I want to see stuff like that. If memory serves, a good example of that might be the film Adanarjuat the Fast Runner, though my memory could be misleading me. To give some more specific examples, I would like to see a period drama which is basically like a Victorian romance but set in pre-Columbian times. Or I suppose a Victorian Six Nations, I would do. And I don't just mean like Pride and Prejudice with a different skin. It would have to be rooted in the culture in the same unconscious way that Pride and Prejudice is rooted in English culture. On a video game side, I would like to see a survival game that places the community as the central focus. Most, if not all, survival games that I've seen, they sort of lean into this rugged, individualist, American mythological nonsense type thing. Or else they're RTS God game type things. I want to see a game where you've got a community that's dependent on you, and you are just as dependent on that community. I could come up with infinite ideas, but I don't want to drag this section on too much. Final question of the day. What are your thoughts on podcasts, streaming, and long-form content in general? I'd like to hear your perspective as a person who makes videos, but also your opinion as a consumer of this type of media. I'm all for podcasts if they're formatted correctly. I don't see any point in live streams whatsoever. And I'm all for long-form content if the length is warranted. I have a specific theory of media, namely that any given piece of media should be exactly as long as it needs to be and not a second longer. I think that if any given second of a video can be cut without compromising either the information or the tone, then it should be cut. This does not mean I believe all media should be short or fast-paced. In the film 2001, there's a scene towards the end which is basically just a visual and auditory assault. A lot of people criticize this scene because it's long, hard to watch, and nothing of narrative significance happens in it. I firmly believe this scene is necessary for establishing the desired tone of the ending of the film. Rather, I think Kubrick should have cut the scene with the Velcro shoes and the space toilet. To give another example of what I'm talking about, if you're doing a review of a video game, I don't need 1,000 little reasons why the game sucks. I need 1 or 2 big ones. I don't care that in Alien Isolation, in this one little corner behind this stuff where most people are never going to see it, the textures are misaligned. I don't care about that. What I care about is that it fundamentally misunderstands its source material. Devoting time to minutiae like that detracts from the legitimate points, thus weakening the overall argument. It's like putting your finger over a hose. The more focused shot has the more power. On the subject of my video production habits, I don't tend to produce long-form content because it's extremely time-consuming. For example, not counting research, my Beaver Wars video took about 200 hours to produce. This one was fairly short and it still took like 6.5 hours.